So where was Mortlake's manor house, and why is it worthy of a talk? For more than 500 years, from before the conquest in 1066 until the late 16th century, Mortlake, with its manor house at its centre, was a place of great importance. The manor of Mortlake included what are now Putney, East Sheen, Roehampton, and Wimbledon. By 1086, Mortlake Manor was already well established, and is described in the Domesday Survey of that year as a prosperous manor of some 8,000 acres. The early village of Mortlake would have been centred around the manor house and along Thames bank. At some time before 1066, the manor had passed into the hands of the Archbishops of Canterbury, and the Archbishops used the manor house as a country residence. The manor house is often referred to as the Archbishop's Palace. The Archbishop was lord of the manor, and therefore this was his manor house. But bishops were also princes of the church, and so the manor house was also referred to as a palace, in the same way that Lambeth and Fulham palaces are so called today. This map from 1865 shows the position of the palace. River to the north, Ship Lane to the west, the Lower Richmond Road and the High Street to the south. In 1995, the Museum of London excavated part of the manor house site before new brewery buildings were constructed. Those excavations didn't produce much physical evidence of the manor house, but the museum did produce a very thorough report. And this is an outline plan from that report. Here again you can see the river, Ship Lane, and the Lower Richmond Road. It also shows the position of the tithe barn. Local tenants would have to give the lord of the manor 10% of their crops, and this is where they were stored. A steward would be appointed to the manor to oversee the working of the manor lands and to collect the tithes. And this is a photograph of that tithe barn, taken in about 1860. The manor house was positioned on the river for easy access to London, and was a good stopping-off point for those travelling by river between the palaces at Westminster and Greenwich, Richmond and Hampton Court. We know quite a lot about the manor house, but what we do not have are any drawings. So we must look elsewhere in order to know how the house was designed and how it worked. So what would the early manor house in the 11th century have looked like? This is a drawing of Boothby Pagnell in Lincolnshire, a manor house built in around 1200. It still exists today. Early manor houses were typically made of stone and built on 2 floors with a tile roof. There was a main hall on the ground floor, an area where people ate, slept, and socialized. It would have offered the best of comforts that was available at the time, and a vast improvement on the wooden hovels that the villagers were used to. Glass was rare and expensive, but there would have been glass in the windows in the Archbishop's palace. This early manor house would have been improved, enlarged, and updated over the centuries. Then along comes Archbishop Bourchier. And this is his coat of arms. Thomas Bourchier was the great-grandson of Edward III, and Archbishop from 1454 to 1486, some 34 years. Bourchier was a very wealthy and powerful man. He was also a man of culture and a great builder of fine houses. As Archbishop, he acquired the manor of Mortlake with its manor house in 1454. At that time, the parish church stood within the manor house grounds, and Bourchier gave this church a stone font. When the current church of St. Mary's was built 100 years later, the font was preserved, and you can still see it in the parish church today. And this is a photograph of that font with the Archbishop's insignia, including his cardinal's hat, around the top. We mustn't forget that the church was an immensely powerful institution in medieval times. It governed almost every aspect of people's lives and was the framework on which society was built. The Archbishop of Canterbury's palace in Mortlake would therefore have been an impressive building. No expense would have been spared to ensure that the Archbishop had every comfort. Archbishops frequently resided here in Mortlake, and 3 of them died in the manor house. I don't think this is an indication that there was a problem with Mortlake, but it was a peaceful place for an archbishop to stay if he was ill or very frail. And it was not only archbishops who visited Mortlake. Several English monarchs also made the journey by river to the manor house. King John was here in 1206, Edward I in 1270 and 1292, Edward II in 1309 and 1318. Edward III made frequent visits. Henry VI came in 1441, Edward IV in 1480. Henry VII was known to hunt here, and he also stopped at Mortlake with Catherine of Aragon on their wedding day. They were on their way to Richmond Palace. This indicates that the manor house at Mortlake was a large complex, able to accommodate the huge retinues of kings, queens, and bishops. But let us go back to Archbishop Bourchier. He acquired Mortlake in 1454 and bought Knowle House in Sevenoaks 2 years later. This is Bourchier's stained glass window in Sevenoaks Church. Mortlake Manor House was rebuilt by Bourchier, and according to local historian Caroline Crimp, he based Mortlake's Manor House on the floor plan and size of Knowle House. This is not an unreasonable deduction. The basic size of the 2 buildings is almost identical. They both cover 4 acres. They were rebuilt within a few years of each other by the same man and on an apparently impressive scale. Knowle's layout was typical of manor houses in the medieval and early Tudor times, and it is certain that Mortlake's manor house would have followed the same style. This is a plan of Knowle House. The main gate at 1, the main courtyard at 2, surrounded by servants' quarters, bakehouses, stables, stores, etc. Then through a second doorway at 5 to grander, more private quarters, other courtyards, and a chapel beyond. And this is a photograph of Bourchier's tower at Knowle, built in local ragstone with the public courtyard in front. Notice the clock tower and the inner gateway. And this is a drawing of Fulham Palace inner gatehouse. Notice the similarity to Knowle with its clock tower and gate leading to the private quarters. Fulham was the residence of the bishops of London from the 11th century. It was of less importance than the Archbishop's residence, so would not have been as grand as Mortlake. But again, they would have been built on similar lines and style. Its great hall was built in 1495. This is a plan of Fulham Palace. The typical main gate, the courtyard surrounded by servants' quarters, bakehouses and stalls, etc. Then through a second doorway to the grander private quarters of the palace and other courtyards and a chapel, just like at Knowle. This is a recent photograph of the outer gatehouse at Fulham, with the original cobbled roadway. And this is a tower by the inner gateway, with its elaborate Tudor brickwork. These photographs give us a taste of what Mortlake would have looked like. We can say, therefore, with some confidence, that Mortlake Manor House would have resembled in style and size a typical manor house such as Knowle House and Fulham Palace in the mid-15th century. According to the archaeologists at the Museum of London, the arrangements of other palaces in England were also built, almost without exception, on these lines. A gateway leading to an outer court, which acted as a dividing area between the public areas and the sumptuous private apartments of the palace itself. But Mortlake's 15th century manor house had not finished developing. We are now in June 1536, and Thomas Cromwell has just become Lord of the Manor of Mortlake. No longer does the manor belong to the Archbishops of Canterbury. Archbishop Cranmer was the last to hold Mortlake. It is worth considering Hilary Mantel's book, The Mirror and a Light, here. The 4-year period that Cromwell was Lord of the Manor are the same years covered in her book, and there are references to the manor house scattered throughout. In the spring of 2017, Hilary came to spend some time in Mortlake to see for herself where the house stood and to explore the area that Cromwell knew so well. Thamesbank, the upper and lower Richmond roads, the bend in the river, as seen from the top of Ship Lane, Bourchier's font, the walk to Putney. And Mantel wanted it all to be familiar to her too. One evening, in the summer of 1536, Cromwell says to his nephew Richard, "I am going to Mortlake, to my new house." Not one to scrimp on splendid buildings, Cromwell immediately ordered loads of timber, wainscoting, brick, lime, sand, iron, yellow ochre, and other materials to be brought from Hampton Court by river for use at the manor house. These materials were for internal decoration and new domestic quarters, so no doubt he would have created an impressive building. Cromwell often visited the manor house at Mortlake during his 4 years of tenure. He spent much of October 1537 here, for example, and his son Gregory was married here to Jane Seymour's sister, Elizabeth, in August of that year. It has been said that Mortlake Manor House was the residence closest to Cromwell's heart because of his family ties here. His older sister Catherine was married to Morgan Williams, who lived in the old Cromwell house, just a few hundred yards or so from the manor house, and Cromwell would certainly have stayed there as a child. However, the king took back the manor and its house in early 1540. Cromwell was created Earl of Essex soon after, but he then fell from favour with the king and was beheaded in July 1540. But we are not quite finished with the king's chief minister just yet. When the manor house was returned to King Henry, he ordered that an inventory be taken of the house. This was undertaken by Robert Throckmorton. The original inventory is in the National Archives. It describes the rooms and lists the main items of furniture and fittings. But most importantly, it tells who the occupants were in the main rooms and the size of the mats on the floor. We thus have an idea of the floor size in each principal room. I have created a simplified plan of the manor house following this inventory. If we begin at the main gate, we have a gatehouse which had a portcullis entrance. The palace faced Mortlake Green, and this main gate stood where there is now a round-fronted building. A storehouse, a woodhouse, bakehouse, joinery, a coal house, and numerous other chambers surrounded the main courtyard. These were the more public areas of the palace, and where the physical, noisy work was done. The privileged few would enter the inner gateway, where there was access to the main hall and stairs. Here was also an inner courtyard. This style of building with internal courtyards ensures that as much light as possible enters the rooms. Visit Fulham Palace and you'll see how it works. The service chambers on the ground floor comprised of a wet larder, a pastry, a dry larder, a boiling house, kitchen, scullery, pantry, and the cook's chamber. Cromwell was a hospitable man who lived splendidly, so it is not hard to imagine him developing the kitchens and other service areas. They needed to be able to cope with his lavish lifestyle. Cromwell was a generous host. Moving up to the first floor. These various chambers are of a minimum of 5 to 6 meters in width and length. A gallery of at least 15 meters long, and the two great chambers formed 3 sides of a square around an inner courtyard. Cromwell's apartments consisted of 2 large rooms and 2 sets of double doors. And Mantell has Cromwell deciding that Richard can have the corner room next to Risley, and how he must put a guard on the privy stairs. There is also a small chapel for the personal use of the lord of the manor. If it is anything like Bourchier's chapel at Knowle, Mortlake's would have been magnificently bejewelled and feature fabulous stained glass windows. This is a very neat representation of the manor house, and there would have been other small rooms and closets which were not recorded. It may even have had more stories and other rooms arranged around other smaller courts and gardens. Fulham Palace is a hodgepodge of chambers and stairs. Also, in the original document, it is difficult to decipher some of the room descriptions due to water stains. For example, there's a minstrel's room somewhere. The manor house would certainly have been more complex than the rectangle I have drawn. But the rooms here are the principal rooms described in the King's inventory, so it gives us a good idea of the mid-16th century building, a reasonable representation at least. We can also get some idea of how the interior of the house looked. This is a photograph of a room at Sutton House in Hackney, which was built in 1535 by Ralph Sadler. Sadler worked for and was very close to Thomas Cromwell. It shows what a wealthy merchant's chamber looked like in the 1530s, with its wood panelling and stone fireplace. The house is now owned by the National Trust. And these are chairs and a chest from Sutton House, all typically made from English oak. This impressive linen-fold wainscoting would have been much the same as that Thomas Cromwell ordered from Hampton Court for Mortlake. Grand but not ostentatious, and of the finest quality. But to return to the history of the site. The king took back Mortlake Manor in 1540 and granted it to Catherine Parr. In 1545, Robert Lord, paymaster of works at Hampton Court, received £2,051 for work done at the king's houses at Mortlake and Sion. By this time, parts of both houses were being used for the manufacture of munitions of war. What had always surprised me was that there was so little physical evidence of Mortlake Manor House. Nothing seems to have survived, and it was a complete ruin by the 18th century. But an entry in the history of the king's works gives us some clues as to what happened to the building. In February 1544, the manor was granted by the king to Catherine Parr, who held it until her death in 1548. Then in 1551, Edward VI's Privy Council decided to allow Lord Edward Clinton, later Earl of Lincoln, to have the brick, stone and timber and other things at his choice of the decayed and uncovered house at Mortlake and of the ruined church there. So the best bits of Mortlake Manor House were dispatched to Lord Edward Clinton's home in Falkingham, Lincolnshire. His house is later described as decayed magnificence and of utmost splendour, so he probably hadn't left much behind in Mortlake. And this is a painting of Lord Clinton, 1st Earl of Lincoln, by Holbein. But let's return to southwest London. Mortlake Manor remained in royal hands until 1576, when it was granted to Sir Thomas Cecil. Cecil chose to build a grander manor house in Wimbledon. What was left of Mortlake's manor house was still standing in 1663, and the gatehouse was an inn during the 1660s. But by the 18th century, all that remained were derelict ruins. While we do not have any pictures of Mortlake Manor House itself, we do have some pictures of the periphery of the manor house site. The palace was surrounded by an imposing wall designed to be defensive and to protect it against high tides, as well as to allow privacy to the occupants. Sir Richard Phillips, in his eyewitness accounts of 1817, described the wall, half a mile in length, which surrounded the palace, and on which was built a gazebo overlooking the river. Phillips describes these walls and gazebo as being Plantagenet. He also describes how he walked westward along Mortlake High Street and saw, facing what is now Mortlake Green, the ancient gateway then bricked up and the ruined walls of the palace. This is a part of Samuel Lee's Panorama of the Thames, painted from the river in 1829. You can see the Ship Inn and Ship Lane, and again the north part of the wall which surrounded the manor house with its gazebo. The blue house is the ferry house. And this is a continuation of the wall going east. The pink house is the Cedars, where Charles Phillips of the brewers Phillips and Wigan later lived. And going further east is the malt house and brewery, with the site of Bull's Alley on the crease. The manor house with its church and graveyard occupied this entire site. And if you walk down Ship Lane towards the river today, the brewery wall on your right follows one side of the manor house site to the river. And then if you turn right, you can follow the towpath towards Barnes until you reach Bull's Alley. This follows Samuel Lee's drawings, and you will get an idea of how extensive the entire manor house site was. This is a drawing of Thames Bank looking west in 1838 by E.W. Cook. It shows a part of the massive north wall with the gazebo built into it. The Thames barge is pulled up at the Ship Lane draw dock. The site was then occupied by a market gardener called Penley, whose family had worked the land since the Civil War. Penley reported digging up skeletons when working the soil, presumably from the cemetery that had been attached to the early church. The now ruined gazebo on the north wall still overlooked the river for a few more years, but the palace had long gone. This 1820 watercolour by George Barrett Jr. shows Thames Bank before it was built up, and the walls of the manor house. There is no evidence that there was a river entrance to the palace, as there is at Greenwich or Hampton Court. So visitors would have pulled up at the Ship Lane draw dock and entered the palace from there. The brewery was to encroach over the entire manor house site from the mid-19th century. As you know, the site is to be developed. There is to be another archaeological examination before new building can begin, and we can only hope they find some remains of the manor house and church, just some foundations, so that we can confirm once and for all the true size and extent of the buildings. But whatever happens, we can say with certainty that over the following few years, another layer of history will be added to the site of Mortlake's magnificent manor house. But to return to the 16th century for one last glimpse of the palace. John Leyland, chaplain, librarian, and antiquarian to Henry VIII, began a journey around England in 1538 at the request of the king, and he described all he saw. He wrote of the palace at Mortlake, which translates as: "From here there is also Mortlake, a superb house and a notable home, a special splendid house." That was Mortlake's magnificent manor house.